New Mexico leaders holding a press conference on the steps of our nation's capital, calling for oil and gas drilling to be kept away from the sacred site, Chaco Canyon. For 150 years, archaeologists told the same tidy story about the Anna's peaceful farming people who built near perfect ruins, and a question no one could answer.
A fascinating and mysterious history. Then the science caught up, and almost none of that story survived. The bones beneath the great houses held a hidden dynasty, something far darker buried in the ruins. Probably all populations, all races, all people at some one stage or another have practiced cannibalism. What the archaeologists found did not solve the mystery of the Anazi, it blew it apart. The impossible canyon.
To understand what the science overturned, the place itself has to come first. Chaco Canyon sits in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, a shallow cut of sandstone about 9 miles long, surrounded by very nearly nothing. There is no river of any consequence. There is no fertile valley and no obvious reason looking at the ground today why anyone would choose to build there at all. And yet between roughly the years 900 and 1150, this empty seam of stone became the political, religious, and architectural center of a civilization that reached across some 90,000 square miles. Then the distribution zone of the Chacoan great houses, and they fall in time from about 900 to 1150. That is the time of the Chacoan phenomenon. That is an area larger than the entire island of Ireland, organized and connected and pointed inward at a canyon with no water in it. The builders raised more than 150 great houses across that span. These were massive stone structures, some rising as high as 5 stories, some holding more than 600 rooms inside a single building. They were raised to a standard of masonry that modern builders still find difficult to match. The walls were engineered with rubble cores faced in precisely cut sandstone veneer, fitted so cleanly that the joints still hold today after 8 centuries of freeze and thaw. This was not improvised shelter. This was design. The rooms and walls were laid out to track the movements of the sun and the moon across cycles that take decades to complete. High on Fajat, but a spiral carved into the rock catches a single blade of light at midday that marks the summer solstice to within a matter of minutes. The builders watched the sky for a generation, learned its rhythm, and set that rhythm into the stone so it would keep time long after they were gone. Then they connected all of it. A network of roads ran out from the canyon, some of them 30 feet wide, cut in lines so straight they looked drawn with a ruler across hundreds of miles of broken country. These were not ordinary trade routes. They climbed straight up cliff faces instead of going around them, built to say something about the people who made them rather than simply to carry goods. Some of the roads ran out to distant great houses that copied the canyon's architecture. Others seemed to end at nothing at all, at a shrine or an empty horizon. But contact alone changes the picture because ideas travel along trade routes as surely as feathers and bells do. The world those goods came from was not only a world of astronomers and metalworkers. It was a world with a particular way of understanding the universe in which the cosmos was not simply observed but fed, in which ritual at its most extreme sometimes demanded the most terrible offering a community could make. Whether that worldview traveled north with the Macau and the Kaku is one of the hardest questions in southwestern archaeology, and it remains unresolved. The trade goods are certain. What rode along beside them in the minds of the people who carried them is not. And alongside the treasures, the canyon left behind something else. Something one man spent 30 years refusing to look away from. The long witness. For more than 30 years. Christy Turner insisted on looking at what almost everyone else preferred to ignore. He was a physical anthropologist trained in forensic work, and he knew the difference between bones laid to rest and bones treated as something else. When he examined the skeletal collections from Chaco and its surrounding great houses, he found a pattern that did not fit the peaceful farmer's story at all. The bones had not been buried. They had been processed, dismembered, broken open, burned, and scattered. And the damage matched the damage on animals butchered for food. So Turner built a test. He assembled a forensic checklist of 6 criteria, all of which had to be present before he would draw a conclusion. Burning on the backs of skulls, but not the faces. The mark of a head set on the fire. Anvil abrasion, the scraping left when a bone is smashed between 2 stones to reach the marrow. Cut marks from stone tools at the joints where tendon meets bone. Pot polish. A faint sheen left on fragments, stirred inside a ceramic vessel. Fracture patterns from breaking fresh bone rather than old. And the systematic absence of the vertebrae, the richest source of marrow in the body, pulverized and gone. Applied across dozens of sites scattered through the 4 corners. The checklist returned nearly 300 individuals who met the full criteria. Men, women, and children processed in the same way these people processed deer and rabbit. The remains broken down and discarded in the same household refuse. Turner laid it all out in a single massive forensic catalog, and the weight of it was hard to dismiss. For 20 years, critics held a single line against him. Butchering is not eating. A body could be cut apart for many reasons, they argued. A witch execution, a war ritual, a rearial practice without the flesh ever being consumed. It was a fair objection, and the distinction mattered enormously. The damaged bones could establish that bodies had been processed like food, but they could not on their own prove that anyone had swallowed a single bite. The door stayed open, and Turner's conclusions were fought over bitterly for 2 decades. Dismissed by some colleagues as overreach and defended by others as the only honest reading of the evidence. Cowboy Wash. It closed in 2000 at a site called Cowboy Wash in southwestern Colorado. A small cluster of half-buried pits occupied around the year 1150. There, Richard Marler, working with Brian Billman, Patricia Lambert, and their colleagues, found the remains of 7 people, men, women, and adolescents, processed to every one of Turner's 6 criteria and left on the floors of 2 of the dwellings. The houses had been abandoned suddenly, household goods still in place. And in a cold hearth at the center of the site, alongside the cooking vessels, they found a coprolite-preserved human waste left at the scene. Marler designed a test for a single protein, human myoglobin, found only in human skeletal muscle and present nowhere in the gut of a person who has eaten plants or ordinary game. The test came back positive in the coprolite and positive on a cooking pot, while 20 control samples from comparable sites came back clean. The conclusion published in the journal Nature was as direct as the science allowed. Someone at Cowboy Wash had eaten human flesh. Here the story has to be told carefully and honestly. The PBLO and descendant communities, the Hopi, the Zuri, the Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblo have contested this interpretation for decades, and their objection deserves real weight, not a footnote. They have pointed out correctly that accusations of cannibalism have been used throughout American history to dehumanize Native peoples. They have argued that forensic evidence can record that an event happened, but cannot recover what it meant. And they have insisted that whatever took place in those rooms was done to their ancestors, not by a people defined by it. That distinction sits at the center of the question because the larger explanation that has grown around these bones, the idea of an imported Mesoamerican religion of terror administered by a foreign priesthood, is interpretation. It is one reading and it remains disputed. The genetics do not confirm it. What the bones confirm is narrower. The signature is not scattered randomly. It clusters in and around the great houses, the ceremonial heart of the Chacoan world, and it tracks the canyon's own lifespan. The pattern rises as Chaco rises, holds through the centuries of the great houses, and begins to fade almost exactly when Chaco begins to fall. Whatever it was, it belonged to Chaco, and it ended when Chaco ended, which raises the question everything has been building toward. What ended Chaco? When the rain stopped, the end did not arrive from a single direction. And the first signal was written in the rings of trees. The American Southwest is where the science of tree ring dating was first developed. And the surviving wood from this period carries a year-by-year record of rainfall. Laid down one ring at a time for more than 1,000 years. A wide ring means a wet year, a narrow ring, a dry one. And the sequence cannot be argued with. Read carefully, it shows that the warmer, wetter trend that had sustained Chacoan farming for the better part of 3 centuries broke in the middle of the 12th century. Between roughly 1130 and 1180, the Southwest entered a long drought. The winters turned colder, the summers turned drier, and the rainfall that had let Chacan farmers grow maize in soils that should never have supported it began to fail season after season. Chaco had always been vulnerable to exactly this because the canyon itself had no reliable water. The great houses and the roads had never fed themselves. They were sustained by an immense coordinated effort to move food inward from the outlying regions to the ritual core. When the edges could no longer feed even themselves, the tribute stopped flowing and the coordination that held 90,000 square miles together began to come apart. That dependence was the hidden flaw in the whole design. A system that imports its food can be magnificent while the harvests hold, and it can fall apart with frightening speed when they stop. The center had no fallback, no local fields to retreat to, nothing to eat that the failing edges did not send. When the rain failed for a generation, the most ambitious construction project in ancient North America had no second option. Then a second signal appeared, this one in the bones. The process remains that had recurred in the Chaco record for more than 200 years begin to vanish almost exactly when the drought begins. The latest assemblages meeting Turner's full criteria cluster in the decades around 1150. And after 1180, they essentially stop. The system that had produced those remains for a quarter of a millennium ceased to produce them. Whether the local people rose against the ruling lineage, whether the priests lost their authority, or whether the order dissolved under a failing food supply, the bones and the rings cannot say. What they can say is what came next. The long emptying. The great houses were abandoned. Not destroyed, not burned, not sacked by an enemy. Abandoned. The people walked out and left their homes standing, the walls intact, the rooms still holding their objects. By 1200, the depopulation of the canyon was well underway. By 1250, the outlying communities were draining as well. By 1300, the Four Corners region, which had supported one of the most densely organized societies in ancient North America, was effectively empty of permanent settlement. The cause that had once held hundreds fell silent. The dead straight roads were reclaimed by the desert. The great houses raised with such obsessive precision were left to the sun. A second drought, even harsher, struck the Four Corners in the last quarter of the 13th century. The long dry stretch, sometimes called the Great Drought that ran from roughly 1276 to 1299. It fell on a region already weakened, already emptying, and it finished what the first one had started. By the time it lifted, the cliff dwellings and mesa villages across the wider southwest had been left behind as well. This is the exact moment the textbook narrative settles on. The vanishing, the lost civilization, the empty buildings, the unanswered question hanging over the ruins. For a century and a half, it was treated as the end of the story. And this is precisely where that story has always been wrong, because abandonment is not the same as disappearance. A people who leave a place have not ceased to exist. They have gone somewhere. The question was never whether the Chacoan survived the collapse of their system. The question was where they went. Follow the water. They went south and east, and they followed the water. The depopulation of Chaco was not a vanishing. It was a migration. The people who had lived under the Chacoan system walked toward the rivers that still ran toward the Rio Grande, the Little Colorado, and the mesas where farming was still possible in a drying world. They carried with them the knowledge of how to grow maize in hard country, the reading of the sky, and the masonry. And they left behind only the ceremonial centers of a system that had stopped being worth carrying. Their destinations are not a mystery either because people still live in them. The Hopi Mies along the Rio Grande, from Taos in the north down through the valley. These were not founded by strangers wandering in from a vanished culture. They were settled and resettled by the same population, moving out from the failing core toward water that still came, building new villages out of the same skills that had raised the great houses. For more than 600 years, the record of where they went was held in one place only. The oral traditions of their descendants, the Hopi, the Zuri, the Acoma, and the Rio Grande Pueblo, all of whom had said consistently for generations that the people of the great houses were their own ancestors and that no one had truly disappeared. The migration was not a loss of identity. It was the deliberate movement of a people away from a failed center and toward land that could still feed them. For most of those 6 centuries, the academic world declined to treat those traditions as evidence. They were stories. It was decided memory, not history, and not the kind of thing that could sit in a journal beside a tree ring or a potch. So the descendants kept telling the same account. The outsiders kept writing the mystery, and the gap between the two sat unexamined for the better part of a century. Then, the genetics caught up to what the descendants had been saying all along, written in blood. In 2025, a study published in the journal Nature did something the field had never managed before. It was led by researchers working in full partnership with the Picuris Pueblo, a community in northern New Mexico, on a project the tribe itself initiated and controlled. It was the first time a federally recognized tribe in the United States had led and co-authored a genomic study of its own ancestry, science requested by the people it was about rather than imposed on them. The team generated genomes from 16 ancient individuals buried in Picuris territory dating from roughly 1300 to 1513 present-day members of the tribe data spanning the last 1,000 years. The result was a clear and unbroken line of genetic continuity reaching back from living members of the tribe and connecting across roughly 275 kilometers to the ancestral Puebloans of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. There was no population collapse before the Europeans arrived. No replacement, no eraser, and no sign of the later migrations some had used to explain the supposed gap. Just continuity written into the body exactly where the oral traditions had always placed it. The contrast with the past was deliberate. The 2017 work on Room 33 had been done without the involvement of the descendant communities, and it had drawn sharp criticism for exactly that. The Picuris study was the opposite. The remains, the questions, and the conclusions all stayed in the hands of the people whose ancestors they were. The elders had always said their people had never gone anywhere. The genome simply put that knowledge on paper. This is the finding that turns the whole story over. The Hopi, the Zuri, the Acoma, and the people of the Rio Grande Pueblo are not the distant heirs of a lost civilization. And they are not what came after the Anazi. They are the Anastasis still here, farming country. Their ancestors farmed, carrying in their cells the biological record of the people who raised the great houses, cut the roads, and aligned the walls to the sun. Ancient DNA did not rediscover the Anazi. It confirmed something that had never been forgotten except by the outsiders who came later and decided the story needed an ending. What they carried. The people of Chaco were not a riddle that evaporated into the desert air. They'd built something extraordinary in an impossible place, lived under a system still only half understood. And when that system failed them, they did the most ordinary human thing imaginable. They left. They followed the water to higher ground, and they carried their world with them. The farming, the masonry, the reading of the sky. The buildings stayed behind. The people did not. For a century and a half, the silence of an empty canyon was mistaken for the silence of an empty people. While their descendants were living within a few days' walk of the ruins the whole time, the oral histories had been accurate for 800 years. The science arrived late and confirmed what those communities had been saying all along. So here's a question worth sitting with. If the people of Chaco were never lost, how many other vanished civilizations are simply waiting for someone to ask their descendants the right question? Drop what you think really happened inside those great houses in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, subscribe and turn on notifications because this channel covers the cases history got wrong and there are far more of them than anyone wants to admit.